Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me to talk about minimizing grades to focus on learning. My name is Sarah Donovan, and I have a website called ethicaleela.com where I write about my experiences teaching junior high ELA and also a little bit of my experiences teaching at the graduate level new teachers. Um, my blog is not about having answers or 5 steps toward doing anything. It's really just about me reflecting on the complexity of what we do and trying to find the best, most humane way of helping our students. And in many ways, that changes on a daily basis, and it changes based on the needs of the students. So, thanks for being willing to kind of undergo something that's a little messy, but is really for the human beings with whom we are entrusted. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about how I've tried to minimize grades and maybe answer some questions that I anticipate you might have. Okay, so first I just want to talk a little bit about the traditional ways that maybe we've been grading or assessing student learning. And so typically students might have, teachers might have a very narrative approach and writing student a letter based on what they're noticing. And I think that this is very admirable, but I don't know about you. I have a hard time reading this and it's a little overwhelming. And what I notice more than the words is the letter grade next to it. And you can even see how the professor here is ambivalent about C plus or B minus. And if the professor is ambivalent, then you must be, the student must be as well. And here again, a lot of red writing, and it seems like there's an effort to be supportive or offer suggestions for revisions. Um, and I think this is a little bit closer to what we have, but I don't know whether or not this professor is going to make time for the student to make the revisions and even coach the revisions. And again, the purpose behind the revisions is to deepen their learning and understanding about the written word rather than working toward a grade. This one is pretty obvious. There's lots of red writing here, but all I see is the incomplete and the F next to the student's name, though there is a little smiley face. It doesn't quite undo the way that this must feel, and you can see that the student did in fact do a lot of work here. For the little ones writing poetry, this might be a little bit better because of the rubric, and it seems very clear the way that it's being evaluated. However, when you give this to a third grader, are they going to make revisions to get to the fore? Are they going to make revisions to communicate better what their intention is in the poem? Or given that this is a form of art, maybe the way that the student wrote it is what in fact they intended. Here is a beautiful project. And it seems like it's appropriate for the student who's quite artistic to express what she's learning. It seems like it would lend itself to a screencast like this to explain the process in creating this and what each piece communicates about her comprehension or her understanding about how the text was constructed. Could you put numbers on this? Yes, each part could be 5 points, 10 points, 20 points. Again, kind of arbitrary. Could you give it a grade? Yes, but again, how do you know what the student knows and can do, and what would you ask the student to do next based on what they've learned? So it's really about learning and not so much about the product. And similar to this beautiful student. And then here you see the big 5-5 overtaking this puzzle where the student is clearly has some interesting language in here about the characters and the setting and the climax and the problem and key character names and things like that. Again, I'd like this to go along with a screencast or some sort of presentation. But 5 out of 5 doesn't say what's good, what the student knows and can do, and what the student should do next. Is this growth from what she or he has done before, or duplicating things? So again, it's just one piece of the puzzle, I guess. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the difference between assessment and evaluation and grades. And so the whole point behind this project is for us to maybe get a little bit closer to seeing what we're doing in the classroom as always assessing and trying to minimize the evaluation until we absolutely have to. And for me, it's at the end of every quarter. So assessment is heavy on feedback, which can come in a lot of different ways. I got to be honest, I don't do a lot of written feedback. A lot of it is just oral and in conversation. And I leave it to the students to do the writing or the note taking or putting it in their portfolio, what we discuss. So it can be done through conversations or writing. The evaluation is about making a judgment on the quality, which shouldn't really come until the student has had lots of opportunity to practice and revise. The focus of assessment is process, and the focus of evaluation is product. So how did the student create what he or she created? What were the choices? What were the outcomes? What were the moves? And that really gets at more of the critical thinking and being able to say and identify what they know and can do and the why behind it. Whereas a product conflates multiple skills, and the student may not know what he or she did to create that product. So pushing it a little bit further toward focusing on the process and not necessarily the product is an important just shift in thinking. If you ever think about like a final paper that a student turns into, really all the learning happened in the process. And once they give you that paper and they've done the revision, they've had the feedback and they've checked it for grammar, it's a finished product that doesn't really need you to say or do anything more than enjoy that piece of work. All of the hard work and the learning has already happened. So again, focusing on the process. The tone of assessment is observational and in many ways personal and also objective in some ways, where it's just sort of saying, here's what I'm noticing, here's what I'm observing. What do you think about that? Versus evaluating is saying it's good or it's bad. For assessment, the agents involved, it's much more democratic this way, teacher, student, peers, everybody is sort of assessing and reflecting and adjusting. Whereas an evaluation is just the evaluator. And it could be, the evaluator could be a peer and it could be the student. But again, it's sort of one agent sort of determining if the objectives are met. And if there is going to be any evaluation, I think I would prefer the student to be the evaluator. For the form of assessment, it's written or verbal. As I said, I don't do a lot of written assessment. Lots of comments, lots of observations, plenty of compliments, suggestions. It's always dialogue or conversational. And of course, with evaluation, it could be conversational, but it tends to be more in the form of letters or numbers. And the scope of assessment is absolute, meaning it's viewed as, excuse me, viewed as existing independently of others. So really trying to think about the evaluation, the assessment being just specifically to that one individual student versus evaluation being a comparison. These are the standards where everybody is sort of compared against a certain objective and a certain standard. And I think anybody who's tried to use a rubric or tried to give a final grade, it starts to get really messy when you're like, well, what is an A and what is a B and what's a 4 and what's a 3 and well, this does one thing and this does something else, or I feel like this is creative, so I want to give it a 4, but it's sort of missing the grammar, so I want to give it a 3 instead, and then let's put them in different categories so we can talk about grammar and creativity separately, but then in the end you have to mush it all together anyway and give some sort of an average. So all of that gets really messy. So I like assessment because it's just absolute focusing on what that one student can do, and it can put all the skills in and strategies separate, keeping it so you know what the student is strong at and what the student is still working at. Okay. So I'll just say a little bit about Alfie Kohn, who's really, his work is what has most inspired me in addition to Mark Barnes and Star Sackstein. But Alfie Kohn says, you know, studies have shown that too much attention to the quality of one's performance is associated with more superficial thinking, less interest in whatever one is doing, less perseverance in the face of failure, and a tendency to attribute the outcome to innate ability and other factors thought to be beyond one's control. So, what's different in assessment is you're not always focusing on quality as you are focusing on the process and the thinking and the steps and the strategies and the approach and how it's impacting the student and what works best for the student instead of just focusing on product and quality. So Alfie Kohn would ask you to just think about the reason for trying to evaluate the quality of any student's efforts. Like, why do you want to put the A? Why do you want to say 100%? Why are we leaning toward that? And he just sort of offers 3 reasons. Either we're trying to rank them to decide who's the best, we're trying to like motivate them to do more. Say it's 5 points, it's 100 points, and if you revise this, you can get an A, and A sounds really great. And instead of, it will help you understand it better. You'll understand the way texts work on you more. You'll understand the writing process better. It will communicate what you're meaning in a more effective way. A lot of times we're just using grades and points to motivate students. Or are we offering feedback to help them become more adept at or excited about what they're doing? And I hope that we're leaning toward 3, though I admit a lot of the reason that I use grades and extra credit and things like that for many of years was trying to motivate students. For whatever reason, they were programmed just to say, oh, it's worth 100 points. Okay, I'm going to do it. It's worth 5 points. So I'm not going to do it. So this is, again, just shifting the thinking. So how do I shift my practice toward assessment and do less grading? Here are some of my, okay, these are 6 things that I think. 1, just for a little while, refuse to put numbers and letters on assignments. Just do it for a little while. And you'll notice the students are like, well, what's my grade? Or how many points did I get? And you can say, well, tell me what you learned and tell me what seems most important. What do you think you did the best? And you're starting to have a conversation about it. Otherwise, once you put the number or letter on an assignment, the conversation ends. Try to only respond with feedback. So again, no letters, no numbers. This is what I noticed you doing. This is what I like. Can you tell me more about what you meant here? Make all of your sort of objectives about becoming. And what I mean like that is becoming a worldly leader, becoming better at finding the reason for your thinking, becoming an engaged storyteller, becoming a more vivid writer. And then you would say, point to the places where you think are more vivid. Point to the evidence that shows you're more worldly. Point to the part where you're an engaging storyteller. Can you find that in the video? What did you do there? What do you think it was? And again, it's a conversation. Do all practice and assessment in class. So you want to watch the students writing. You want to watch the students reading. I kind of want to go so far as to say, just don't assign homework. Don't give them things to take home unless it's a book. Just do the reading, do the learning, do the writing in class. Have the conversations in class. Now, you're going to get everything that you need to do the evaluation. They're going to have time to practice. You can observe, you can give feedback, and then just put it on the students to track the stuff in their portfolio. After you have a conversation, have the student write a note and put it in their portfolio, or get on their Chromebook and fill out a quick form. After they read a book, have them take a selfie, a picture of themselves with the book. Teach students how to self and peer assess. So I have in the slideshow a couple slides of students asking us, question stems and sentence stems to ask and respond, to evaluate. Show them how to do it just like you would. Instead of you doing all the work, teach them how to do it, how to respond. And again, you're promoting more conversations about learning. And then just remember that human beings aren't letters and they're not numbers. We don't really like it when our life, our passion, our careers are reduced to a score on the Danielson framework, right? It's dehumanizing in many ways. So don't do it to the students. Okay. Learning is becoming, and becoming takes time. So your goal to them is to give them time. So one of the questions that I've gotten before is like, how do you demonstrate growth? And if you have to show for your evaluation growth, how do you do that? Okay, so I'm just going to give you very quickly. When you start the school year, collect data with your students, okay? And I put data in quotes because it doesn't just have to be qualitative numbers. It can also be quantitative is numbers. It doesn't have to just be that. It can also be qualitative. So the more data you have, the better, and put it in the hands of the student. So whatever map, if you do map score at the beginning, use that. It's just one piece of the puzzle. Some people are really good at that. Some are not. So it's worth being just one part of it. And if the score is below, you need to do some investigation about why. Is it stamina for test taking, time runs out, being hungry, being absent, being rushed, not engaged with the test, not caring about the test? Like, just, you need some qualitative reasoning to go with the quantitative data. Look at their prior grades. Again, are those grades evidence of their compliance, being self-directed, that they care about grades, that they're really absent a lot, or that they're hardworking? What do those grades say? Because we know that grades are not always the best reflection of what a student knows and can do. Create a student survey about reading and about writing and find out from the student how they think, what they think are their strengths or areas of that need a little bit of work, or how much they read, or what kind of books that they have. And does that data jive with other data? Meaning, maybe the student's reading a book a day at home, but their test scores are low. What does that tell you? Or they are really avid readers, super high map scores, but their grades are D's and U's or F's. What does that say? Try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Conferences are the key. Early on, get around to the students, talk to them, read with them, ask questions about what they're noticing in their reading, ask questions about what they're noticing about their writing, use anecdotal notes, and then look at their early work. So in the beginning of your time with your students, you want to be collecting lots of this. And all of these pieces together are going to be their sort of baseline data for what they know and can do. And then the students will create a preliminary sort of portfolio of, of their MAP scores and their prior grades in the survey, so that at midterm and then at the end of the quarter, they can go back and look at their artifacts and see what's different. Okay, so this is the idea of learning. What can they know and do coming into your classroom? How have they previously been evaluated? And then what can you teach them? So your lessons and mini lessons become what you're noticing are some trends in your class. And then your individual conferences with students or small groups are the things that you're noticing in smaller numbers of your students that you can do quick little intervention lessons on. And the students will document what they're learning. And then by the end of the quarter, hopefully what you've done has worked. And if it hasn't, then you need to keep problem solving. So here's just sort of a sample 9-week quarter for me. I have 9-week quarters at my school. So I just set it up with sort of the first 4-ish weeks are gathering data, doing mini lessons, lots of independent reading, tracking their progress. And then around week 4 and 5, we create a small portfolio of what we've learned and reflect on it. That midterm week is also the time where we revise things. So if students created some sort of artifact or a book report or a blog or a presentation, it's an opportunity for them to revise that, make it better. Week 6, 7th, and 8th of the quarter, they're again going back in. You've looked at their portfolios, you know what else you can do to support them. You develop some more mini lessons, and then they revise, update their portfolio. And then week 9, you have individual conferences about their final grades. So the way that you see growth is from beginning, middle, and end. And the students are pointing to the evidence that shows how their reading has changed, how their thinking about reading has changed, where they can point to specific skills that you taught, and you'll see all the evidence that you need right there. So here's just a typical stay in our classroom. This changes each quarter, it changes as it needs to, but we have about 40 minutes in my reading class. So I usually spend the first 10 minutes working on a sort of whole class language lesson or mini lesson. They spend 25 minutes reading. Um, this is where I take small groups or um, maybe 2 or 3 students, or sometimes a bigger group of 5 or 7, and work on specific mini lessons with them. And then the last 5 minutes, we're sort of doing tracking our progress. So while I take a small group, the rest of the class is doing independent reading, adding to their portfolio, those sort of lessons. So a typical quarter for me, I usually kind of map out my objectives. And these are all around the Common Core. So author's craft and listening, speaking, um, reading experiences, uncovering like language or vocabulary, and close reading. So this is just, I'm doing everything that's in the Common Core. I just don't really call it that or have the numbers and things like that with the students, but I essentially am teaching all these things in a mini lesson. So whatever grade level that you have your own standards. You maybe already have these beautiful units that you do. I just encourage you to not put numbers and points and things on there, and instead, whatever the students produce, have them put that in a portfolio and build in time for them to reflect. So a way to document progress is to, again, have the students maybe creating some sort of form, or a Google form is a great way to do that. Or starting a slideshow, and then every time they're done conferencing with you, they can make a new slide and call it a conference slide. Or maybe you want to have the students work on making a video, and they can put the video in there as well. And I just usually keep some sort of a folder or a binder. Every student has their own page, and I can write notes in there as well. So if a parent or administrator is asking me questions, I can do that. Sometimes I've even put assignments or artifacts that students have created in the online grade book that we have to keep. So I might just put those in there with blank grades or no points, as just sort of a checklist of the different artifacts that students have created, whether or not they've been finished or they're in the process of revision. So I kind of have these numbers over here. This is just my system of just noting after I've met with the student if they seem to be meeting the standard, if they're in the process of revising something, or if they just don't have any evidence for me to look at yet. And then these are like alerts to me that I need to follow up with these students. So whatever method you have, you do need to develop something of who you've checked in with, who you need to go back to, and how things are going. But essentially, all of that is being taken care of during the midterm, and then again at the end of quarter portfolio. And you're giving them plenty of time in class to make revisions, to redo artifacts. So, late work doesn't really play into this because everyone's doing things in class. Revisions are essential to the learning. So there's no points deducted if someone's going to try things a couple different times. And whether they do it week 2 or week 8 doesn't really matter. And I know all this is a lot to get to wrap your head around if you've never done something like this before. But think about it. Like, someone may not be ready to do something about text evidence or citing a passage from a book at week 2, but then after they've read several books and they can compare different books or different stories or characters, or then they're ready to do it. So if they're ready at week 8 and not at week 2, eventually they can demonstrate that they know and can do something. So here's an example of a lesson that I have, or a project really that I've done in class, that again puts the students' stories at the center. So we don't have to talk about letters and grades. We're just really focusing on the power of stories, the power of writing, the power of communication. So this is the standard of effective speaking. And here you can just see, like I've just broken it into a couple different skills, just like any rubric would. But I sort of just have a category of meeting or a category of needing revision. So if a student does a speech in week 2 and their eye contact isn't great, then they're going to come back at different times, probably at midterm and at the end of the quarter, and maybe do a new recording of it or do another speech, and then they'll be able to show growth. The students who are listening are practicing text evidence. They're also practicing author's craft, trying to recognize specific features in author's narrative writing style. And they're able to essentially read or listen to 30 different stories of their classmates. And, and they're practicing their listening skills as well, and they're practicing their text evidence. So at the end of the quarter, maybe they don't have a lot of text evidence from their independent reading, but they have text evidence from class story time or something along those lines. As I said earlier, these are just some of the phrases that we use when we're responding to peer writing or peer presentation. And then we practice complimenting and talking about this in class. So as I said, you want to teach the students to do this. So you can be an observer and they'll have evidence of their ability to use text evidence to listen to their classmates, to identify writing style and author's craft. So I talk about this is sort of like the rhetorical triangle, that when we're listening to stories or other people's writing, we're talking about how we can relate personally or how the author is speaking to our heart or pathos, how the author is speaking to our mind or logos, and how the author is establishing their credibility or ethos. So it's sort of the writer's talent or skills. So I can relate to this part because this phrase got me thinking about, because I noticed you use the technique of like alliteration in this phrase of, and it's effective because, so again, we're teaching them to think and speak and write like readers and writers do. This is just one of the slides that I use when we're complimenting one another on our work. So after there's a presentation and the student who just presented is doing their speaking evaluation, then the class has an opportunity to compliment or celebrate that speaker. So again, we're getting at the community of readers and the focus on the humanity of what literature does for us. And we're also trying to relate and treat one another with respect. So we're giving a compliment. I'd like to celebrate Julie for her sensory language when she said, the sky wept with thick raindrops or something like that. And it made me feel sad, or it made me wonder what happened or things like that. And then Julie just has to say thank you. So I have in the next couple slides are things that are posted on my blog, which are the kinds of questions that I use in the conferring part of the classroom. And I can't emphasize enough how these questions are the most important thing that you're doing as a teacher, is when they are reading and they are writing and you're sitting alongside them asking these questions. And this is where the growth starts to happen, where the students are reading and you get to see, tell me about what you're noticing. And they'll say, oh, I really think this part is funny. And then you get to say, what do you think makes that funny? What is the author doing there? And then that is where the student starts noticing that the author is a human being who's crafting that piece. Or what do you think is going to happen next? Well, what makes you say that? What is the author doing in the text that's sort of putting that possibility in your brain? Or what other things have you read that kind of follow that pattern? That's text structure. So that's where you're teaching one-on-one what each kid needs. Sometimes they're just trying to figure out context clues. And sometimes they're really recognizing how one author is so similar to another. And this is where you get to differentiate. So I'm not going to read through these questions or this approach, but you can look at these. This is from Terry Lassane's making the match from Donaldson and Nilsson's Literature for Today's Young Adults. This is older work, but I've sort of adapted it as to the different reasons that real readers are reading. So just delight, because it represents their culture, because they're living a different life through that character, because they're thinking about why things exist, or just pure aesthetic experiences, just being blown away by the beauty of the literature. So these can be questions that you ask, or what you're trying to figure out about why students are reading something, and then you can suggest something in a different kind of reading experience to stretch them. So maybe they're always reading autobiographically, things about them, but you can say, let's try something for a vicarious experience. Let's try this book. It's another teenager like you, and it is a boy, but it's a boy from this culture. It's a boy who's had a different kind of experience. And that's where you get the growth, by suggesting or pushing gently the student to stretch into something different. And this is my rhetorical reading. This is my work, where especially useful in historical fiction. When an outsider has written a text about a historical event, or just it could be an insider as well, and thinking about um, how the author is sort of establishing their knowledge about the situation, how they're trying to trigger certain experiences and feelings in the reader, and how the book is teaching us as well, or the logo. So this is another way of coming at it. Notice there's tons of question marks in here that you can use when you're talking to students, that stretches them into thinking about reading as rhetorical. I also tend to post some reading responses after independent reading time that are pretty general, that almost anybody can respond to. And this could be in a form, on a blog, in a notebook. And this is another artifact that students can use to prove their growth. They can say, look at the way I was responding to the literature at week 2, and look at how I'm responding to the text at week 8. You can see I have text evidence. You can see I'm pointing at author's craft. You can see I'm being more specific. And again, that's the qualitative data that will show growth. Now, the question is, can you still give a test? Because anytime you create a test that has like blanks to fill in or multiple choice, when they're done, you want to just put a letter grade on there or give them points for everything that they've done. So I'm going to say you can give a test, but I'm going to say it's a loving test. So it's kind of different because there's no points assigned to what they're doing. So here's just a sample page of a test that we gave after the Absolute True Diary of a Part-Time Indian. We read that book partially as a whole class, partially in small groups, and then the students finished the last 35 pages on their own, and then sort of took a test on the ending, plus some of the things that we did earlier in the unit. Now, what I mean by a loving test is I mean that it's designed to synthesize and review, and to think about new things, because once they finish the book, they have the whole story that they can think about. Oh, this came up again and again, or this is why this happened early on, because it comes up at the end, and that makes sense. Oh yeah. So the test should be designed to help the students synthesize everything that you learned. You should give the students as much time as they need. And maybe you're going to set aside 3 days and some need 5, but you can give them other things to do while some are still finishing. Do it on paper so that you can walk around, read, and write feedback on their paper, so as not to disrupt others, and so that you can also walk around easily. If they're doing it on a technology, sometimes, especially the Chromebooks, it's hard to kind of bend down and look at their screen, and then you can't really take over the keyboard and type feedback or things like that. So also, you're sort of assessing the test as they go. So if something is right on the money or it looks good, I usually put my initials and say, gosh, that's some good thinking right there. Or I see how you're connecting one part. Actually, good is kind of evaluative. So I might say, I can see how you're connecting something from the beginning to this part here. I think you did a good job noticing that. That's what the author had intended. I might whisper that, right, while they're taking the test. Or if there's a part that they're not quite getting, I might write a page number and say, check out this page number, reread that part, and I'm going to come back and take a look. So it's a little bit of evaluating, but it's closer to assessment at the end of a unit. So I'm conferring as they test. I'm asking questions, why did you write this, or what were you thinking? And sometimes I might think that that's wrong. But once they tell me their reasoning or the process for coming to that, that makes a whole lot more sense to me. And I'm like, in fact, that's right. How many times have you created a test and then you start to read it and realize maybe you wrote a horrible question and then you marked all of these wrong and then you realize that they were actually right because you wrote the question wrong. So it's better just to sort of assess it as they're taking the test. So again, ask questions to gauge their thinking. Let them talk through their responses. Encourage rethinking if they're way off. Praise creative or divergent thinking if it's not quite what you thought, but it does make sense. Prompt the use of the text for rereading. So again, maybe give them a page number to reread, offer page numbers, and then when they're done, add it to their portfolio. So a student can never fail your class because they've done the work in your class. And maybe they didn't read, maybe they were fake reading, but they will have at least this test and evidence of their thinking for the 3-ish days that they took it during your class. They reread, they learned something, they synthesize things, and they feel good about it, you feel good about it. So you might want to try book groups as another way of getting evidence. Book groups value diverse experience. They impact understanding. So I might understand something different after being in a group with you. They invite different ways of knowing, and they offer opportunities to have conversations. So these are some of the books that I've used. On the blog, I have put recordings of their book groups. So if there's 5 or 6 book groups going on in the class, and I can't listen to each one, I put a little recorder, like a little digital recorder. It's $20 from Amazon, and I record, or they record, their book group discussions, and then we upload them to their Google Drive or to a blog or to their slideshow, and then they have evidence of their book discussion. These are some questions that I offer students to write at least 2 really great questions before they get in their book groups. So these are text-based questions, but again, the students are in control of their learning. And then we have evidence again of them using verbal skills and collaborating with the group. And a few sentence stems to ask and respond. So on page 32, what's going on is this, so it's summarizing, and here's my question. And to respond, what I hear Julie saying is this, and I'd like to add or suggest because on page this. So it's, again, just pushing them to use the language to promote deeper thinking. And all of this is recorded on their digital recorder as evidence of their reading. And here's sort of a reflection. How did you prepare for today's discussion? When did you use the book for evidence? How did you show appreciation for ideas? When do you invite others to contribute? Again, these are all the speaking and collaboration standards. You can create this in a Google form. And again, that's another artifact of their learning. So you're seeing like what we're doing is creating a portfolio with all these different experiences in the classroom that you probably already do, but you don't have to put a letter or a number on each one. You just give them feedback. And then here's sort of the portfolio. Now, this is just the portfolio part where students talk about their independent reading. So here is sort of talking points that I offered to students. Sorry, I got my summer hair going. The students' talking points for as they share about their individual reading experiences and the different strategies that we've done in class. So by that midterm and the end of the quarter, we've talked about summary and subjects and author's craft and character development. We've talked about sticky notes, using sticky notes for notice and note, like memory moments, older and wiser characters, again and again, all the things that you've done with your mini lessons. The students have created in their slideshow, and then they're going to narrate it with Screencastify and talk about what they learned. So I don't know if this is going to come through or open a new screen. Yeah, here we go. So this is Ureli talking about the entire quarter, but she did part of it at midterm and then part of it at the end of the quarter. So you can see her sticky notes. So this is what they're doing during the time that I'm conferencing with small groups. So I have everyone put 3 sticky notes out so they have some evidence of their reading. Sometimes they're reading picture books with autobiographical, and again, they're using sticky notes. So she's stretching into different genres. Um, Again, you can see she has these different books and she's talking about each one and she has sticky notes to help her talk about those things. So this video is available on YouTube. Okay, so if this is the final um, portfolio, we have to be thinking about um, the next quarter. So if this was our 9 weeks together, when I look at this portfolio, what do I notice about the student? And then what do I think about his identity as a reader? And then what do I need to do next quarter to help the student? So I'm going to show you a little bit of this, but I want to point out what I'm noticing. Now, there's some things that are happening with this reader that I did not pick up on. This reader was a really good fake reader, and he's very verbal. So it wasn't until I saw the video that I realized that he was missing many textual clues and skipping a lot of words. And I realized that I had to be a little bit more careful in our conferences, and then also continue to support his reading. So I'll just show you a little bit of this. Okay, so right away, what I should have done if I would have checked some of the students' notes and maybe been a little bit more careful is that he is missing the historical part of this. And I probably should have suggested read this article or do a little research and help build a little bit of background knowledge. He loved graphic novels, so every book that he read was either a picture book or a graphic novel because he was really relying on the pictures to help him, but he was missing the textual clues. So this is sort of what I would take into the next quarter with this student as far as his growth. The growth is he's finishing books. The growth is he knows what he likes. The growth is that he can identify setting and characters' names. But the place that we need to get a little bit closer is on the comprehension and in the very careful, close reading. And we made a lot of progress on that. So conferences at the end of the quarter. So once students have this portfolio and I watch the portfolio and they watch the portfolio and we meet to have a conversation about their final grade, okay? And I ask them to pick one of these questions to talk to me about and during our conference. So I'll either go to the student if everyone is like reading or working on another project, and I'll sit down and I'll say, which question do you want to answer? And they usually pick one. Sometimes they write it out in their portfolio and then we read it together. So this student talked about what are you noticing in yourself as a reader or thinker that's becoming stronger. Something that I'm noticing in myself as a reader that is getting stronger is my expansion of genres, which was the goal of the quarter. Normally, I'm more into adventures, superheroes, fantasies, magic, and powers, but now that I've read The Prince and the Pauper, a classic book, I feel that I've opened a new door and entered a new universe. More topics are being explored, more questions are filling my brain, itching me to find out what happens next. I guess that's just part of reading books, exhilaration, but it makes me feel better for me to see more in life. So this student talked about, this was a second quarter reflection about the book groups, because we did 2 book groups second quarter. And she said, I think it was a she, I didn't think that we would have done really well. So the students made their own groups. Some were great and some not so great. But they learned lesson from that. So I think it's a she, like, we would have accomplished what was asked, but I have never worked with them, so it was a new experience. From the group discussions of Thursday really showed me how well we worked together and we took time in our questions. However, at the end of this, I noticed that they were the ones that helped me the most. Our book discussion was a success, I think. We all supported, motivated, helped each other when we were stuck with something. And in the discussion, everyone told their opinions or answer when one of us would ask a question. Even if someone had already said our answer that we thought we would say, I agree, and give other reasons why. I like this book group way better. That is what I'm most proud of. So that was great. So she can talk about her qualitative growth, and then the recording is, again, qualitative growth. And the students were able to finish multiple books this way and have evidence of their text evidence and character analysis and things like that. Okay, I also have students do sort of a form about their final grade. We do practice. So I might say, let's say this is Aquaman and he did X, Y, and Z, or this is his portfolio. What grade would you give him? So we sort of practice this a little bit. It seemed really important for some students to say, before we did the portfolio, to kind of say, what does an A look like? What does a B look like? I didn't have answers for this because I didn't really want to focus on it. But ultimately, we did have to do final grades. And this got a little bit of messy, but it was really interesting in that 9th week to talk about where students think they are. And for the most part, I just deferred to them. So essentially, this is kind of how I break down the final grades. It is not perfect, and I think you need to make it what works for you and your community. But essentially, the A and the B, when they have multiple evidence in every category that you're trying to teach. So they have lots of videos of their speaking. They have recordings of their book group. They have lots of sticky notes. They have books that they finished. They have response sheets, things like that. When we're getting down here, they're missing evidence, and it could be from absences. It could be from not using time wisely. It could just be not being engaged. Then here's sort of the quality, and this is where you get the judgment and the evaluation, which is a little, subjective, and it makes me feel yucky when we have to get at the quality. But it's sort of the ideas and the length and the details that have grown by the end of the quarter. The quality in D and U is just not there, and you know it, and the students know it too. And then the A and B is also deep reflection. So they can talk about what they know and can do really well. And the A is if there's sort of an extension project. The way that this has just worked out in our class is by the time we get to the end of the portfolio, some people have been keeping up their portfolio all along. So when I have a whole week set aside for people to do their portfolio, there's inevitably some students, at least, a quarter, who don't need that whole week. And so instead they do an independent project and they're really working on something new, different, stretching their thinking. And those really are the students that get the A. Even though this is not perfect, it's a little bit closer. And when we're on the fence, I just err on the higher grade. This is just another example of what was in Wonder Woman's portfolio. And we just kind of did a grade at week 8. And if they finished a couple more things, they could be at the A if they want to. And again, I don't care about these things, but we have to have this evaluation at the end. So I'm still trying to figure out the best way to do this final evaluation. So I talked about the reflection. So the portfolios and reflection are really essential. And then just a couple things about parents here. I did have some parents telling me how their child was nervous about the grade. Like, this is an example that the child loved the class and was reading a lot, but wasn't clear about their grades or their midterm. And they looked up the grades and it was empty. So they're wondering, what does that mean? And I think even though I had sent emails, I apparently wasn't very clear about this to some parents. So I just needed to email the parent back. And then this was an alert to me that I needed to send out maybe another letter or short video to explain that nothing really would be in the grade book, that we had a portfolio, but the portfolio is accessible to parents. We just have to share it with them and the parents can see it, or it's on the blog and the parents can see it. So all of this is available to anyone who's interested, and it's very easy to share. And then I just had to have a conference with the student to explain it. And so this was my email back to the parent. As you can see, it's quite long, and I was trying to, make the parent feel comfortable about what was going on and try to really explain things to them. And this is the kind of letter that I would send home. And at the end of the year, without a lot of the grades, this is a nice email that a parent sent to me. Thank you so much for teaching Julia reading this year. I liked your method of putting the students in charge of evaluating their own progress and growth. Thank you for encouraging Julia to read different genres and to stretch herself to read more challenging literature. I especially appreciate your effort to keep in touch with both parents and students throughout your texts and emails. Thank you for everything you've done to help Julia become a better reader. So really, it wasn't focused on being successful or having A's, but being a better reader, and that's inevitably what I set out to do. Okay, so there it is. Me just kind of talking through how I've really tried to minimize grades and emphasize learning. As you can see, the beginning of this video, I talked about grades, but as we went through, I was sort of minimizing that and really just talking about gathering evidence and creating experiences where students can read and write and converse and interact. And I feel like that was a much more ethical approach, though certainly messy and difficult to track because it's qualitative. It's harder to confine. But the students are really doing the work and doing the thinking. So it was really great. So remember, learning is becoming, and we're always becoming. So thank you for joining me.